Hello and welcome to our video podcast, It's Good to Talk. This is the third and final episode in our three-part series that has been zooming in on the power of conversations at work and the profound difference that they can make on engagement and performance, which really at its heart is just about looking into human connection and exploring the really simple steps that us as leaders can take to engage our people. I'm really excited about today's topic. It's one that's become more and more common practice over the last few years as we're all forced into a world where we're using virtual conversations more than ever before. So really excited to dive into how that has played out and where we go next as well. So we have got a fantastic panel, as always, with us today. So we're joined by a number of people that have got expertise and insight and passion into this area. Firstly, we've got our very own Ciara Mahon, a colleague from the Oxford Group, and we have two great guests in Elizabeth McManus, who's been connected with the Oxford Group for many years, but has recently stepped into a new adventure at Space to Sea, so which I'm sure she'll tell us more about in a bit. And we've also got Gabriella Havard, Learning and Development Business Partner at the Oxford University Press. And they're both going to introduce themselves and share a bit more about their interest in today's conversation shortly. I suppose, firstly, just to set the scene, Ciara, unsurprisingly for us here at the Oxford Group, managing or leading in a virtual world has been a real hot topic for many of our clients. As I mentioned, with that initial rush as we all grappled to rapidly get into a new way of working when our reality was shifted overnight due to the pandemic and the fact that we moved into a more virtual world in the majority of organisations in most of their operations really quickly. And more recently, we've seen another shift, and that is a shift where people have started to head back into the workplace. And we've got this new hybrid dynamic where we've got some of the team in physical locations and some of the team in remote locations that might be some or all of the time and connecting into each other in different ways, which really creates a bit of a shift in the mindset and skills and techniques that we as leaders need to have in our lockers. And I know, Ciara, you've done quite a bit of thinking about this, so I'll chuck over to you to get your opening views.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So I've been reflecting on the reaction and from what I've heard in terms of the needs of across increased virtual connection from our clients, but also from my own personal experience as well. And from those I've spoken to across my network. And yes, we know that organizations, managers and individuals have been struggling with this shift in the creation of distance or the perception of distance, perhaps due to virtual work. And we know that people do continue to grapple with that, as many of us stay, as you say, within that hybrid working model, and specifically what that has done to the quality of the conversations. And it has fundamentally changed the way that we communicate and connect with our closest colleagues on a daily basis, a weekly basis, but for me, an hourly basis, probably, in terms of those conversations. So for me, it was really important and helpful to actually reflect on the challenges that we see typically, or we did see before the pandemic, we did see before this acceleration in virtual working. So the traditional challenges are, for me, not radically different from the challenges that we see in this shift to virtual connection. So we still see that reluctance, a lack of confidence, a lack of skills in managers having honest, straightforward conversations virtually. We've always seen that before. We've always seen the impact on the lack of performance management. Sometimes that's a challenge in organizations in terms of goals and objectives, and in a virtual world, goals and objectives have been going by the wayside a little bit. But it's also that feeling that it's harder to have those developmental conversations and to spot and nurture talent at a distance as well. So these are some really fundamental organizational challenges. So with that in mind, if these have always been our original face-to-face challenges that we've always been tackling with in organizations and with our clients, and if those are actually the same issues that we're still hearing now, the solution that we know that works and that's always worked, that strikes through these challenges, are that more frequent quality conversations help to build stronger relationships between managers and individuals, and they build trust, which leads to more engagement and positive impact on performance. So with that in mind, going into this conversation with Gabriella, Elizabeth and yourself, Andy, so what can we do? How can we reframe the power of conversations in a virtual world? And practically, how do we go around doing it? And what do we know that works? And do we need to reframe it differently?
Mm.
So yeah, those were my initial thoughts.
Your musings, thank you. Yeah, there's some great questions in there for us to ponder, and I'm sure we'll get into the depths of those as we head through the video cast today. So without further ado, let's introduce our guests. So I'm firstly going to jump to Elizabeth McManus. So Elizabeth, do you want to share a little bit of your perspective on this and your thinking, and then we'll jump over to Gabriella.
Well, Andy, thanks very much. So I'm Elizabeth McManus, and I'm a space maker and a director at Space to See. And I believe that creating space to focus on what matters most helps us not only to live better, but actually to perform to best effect, whether that's virtual, face-to-face, or hybrid. And so my fascination and my privilege really is to work with leaders to achieve that space and what the quality of that space is like. And it's an absolute joy to be with the three of you today to explore how we do that.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for being with us today. And Gabriella, over to you.
Thanks, Andy. Gabriella Havard, I'm Learning and Development Business Partner at OUP. I think my interest has sort of been from a number of different angles. So one is I support managers at OUP and had to think about what that meant during COVID and since then, and what changes needed to be made, and obviously had a lot of input and feedback from managers on what they were finding challenging. So I've had to really think about, okay, what of those challenges, as Ciara was saying, are actually caused by, working virtually? What actually is different in order to try to address those challenges? But I'm also interested in it because I noticed in my own team that our connection, when COVID came about and we all started working remotely, the connection actually increased dramatically. We had an amazing experience, or I had an amazing experience during those early months of COVID. And so I was also, curious to know why, what changed, what was different. And I think a lot of it, my reflection so far, is that some of the needs are the same. It's just thinking about the strategies for meeting those needs. So I like that idea from Marshall Rosenberg, the sort of differentiating between the actual need and the strategy for getting the need met. And I think actually it's helpful for us to realize that the needs are the same in many cases, but the strategy for getting those needs met might be slightly different.
That's really sparked some enthusiasm for what comes next. So some really interesting stuff just to build on. So I'm going to kick off with a question. And Elizabeth, we've had conversations like this so many times around the conditions for success. So from your perspective, what do you think are the conditions that need to be in place for effective virtual connection?
Right. I mean, I think no matter how long we talk about this, there's always more to discover. And when I thought about this, I guess I picked three things. There are probably hundreds of things, but the three that I picked out as really fundamental are presence, interest, and variety. So I'll just say one or two things about each one, Andy, and I'm sure that's going to kick off a whole lot of thoughts. Presence really is, because I do believe whether we're with people in physical presence or virtually, how present we are with them sets the tone. So it's not necessarily how many minutes we're with somebody, but how much of us is with them. And so that issue of paying attention 1 minute at a time and being really, really present, that's my favorite part about the attempt to build a connection with people. The second thing I think is interest, and having to really make sure that we are interested in the person, in the situation. And for me, I love what Gabriella said about the difference between the need and the way we get it met. For me, it's not how do we show interest, it's how do we find interest. Because when we're interested, people know that very well. So that's the second thing. And I think the third thing is variety. Probably my experience in the last couple of years is that it's true to say it requires a little bit of creation of variety for people to stay with something when it's virtual or hybrid. Just on a very practical level, when you're in the room with people, you see the whole environment, there's more going on. When you're a little cube, it's good to mix it up a little bit. So asking more questions, looking at documents on screen for a while, maybe not, maybe having some general conversation using the chat, just so people don't get bored. Being in a cube can be a little bit tedious, so it doesn't have to be. It can be just as interesting as being in person, but it takes a wee bit of mixing it up. So those are my favourites.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That gets us off to a great start. Gabriella, Ciara, any thoughts following on from that? What are your thoughts?
Well, there must be some truth in what Elizabeth's just shared, because when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about it in terms of one-to-one and group, and my 2 points for one-to-one was number 1, presence, and number 2, curiosity, which I think is aligned with what you said about interest. So really consciously asking more questions. And I think, as you say, they apply in person, but then probably could be slightly harder to apply online. Presence because of maybe having back-to-back meetings or more distractions in your environment. The doorbell rings because you've had a package delivered or something, or the notifications coming up. So I think just making it more of a conscious thing, conscious interest, conscious presence. And then the other two that I thought of in a group context was sort of rules of engagement. So really just trying to make it explicit about webcam and microphone etiquette. Like, how does someone speak? Should they raise their hand first, or should they just unmute? If one person doesn't have their camera on, is that okay? Just really having that conversation, setting those ground rules, I guess, in the same way as you would for a group session in person. And then structure, I actually think that structure can help. A little bit of structure can really help online. I remember during COVID, there was a lot of experimenting with having these informal coffee catch-ups where anybody could turn up and just chat. And my observation is that can work if it's a small group and people really know each other well. But if it's a larger group, just having a question that everybody answers, and it can be really informal, and then everyone going around the room, that little bit of structure just helps to create that equality and that safety in the virtual space.
Yeah, and I think to follow on from Gabriella's thinking there, so I definitely went around your down the train of thought of your second point there, Gabriella, around the ground rules, or understanding preferences and what may be allowable as a preference, but then also what are the must-dos, what are the must-haves, what are the hygiene factors, especially for creating those conditions so that you do regularly connect, so that you do show up, so that you are expected to be there with your team and show up, and what times, what places, what moments are absolutely essential, and then what other things might be preferences of individuals, like the times that they work, or maybe if we're not feeling too good about cameras today, is it a meeting that's okay for some of us to not be on camera, etc. So yeah, sort of the contract between the individual, the manager, and the group. That's where I was going in terms of thinking about the conditions that are needed to be in place for really effective virtual connections.
Yeah, thanks all. There's some really interesting stuff in there, and similar to you, I went down the road of the rules of engagement, which I really like as a term there, Gabriella. And the one thing that I've seen is that rules of engagement have been set, but very quickly have kind of gone downhill, and people have wandered into different habits. So I think there's something in around the setting of those rules of engagement, but also the holding of people to those rules of engagement within reason, so that it doesn't all of a sudden become a culture that cameras are off around here when we started that cameras were on. And that can involve sometimes those candid conversations that happen, which sometimes people aren't so comfortable with, but are absolutely essential in maintaining the environment that you want, particularly when working with groups. I think on a one-to-one basis it's slightly different, but even then there are things that we should make sure that once our rules of engagement are agreed, that we're firm and consistent with them, because otherwise people sense that, don't they? Team members sense that, whether you're working with them on a one-to-one or an individual basis, and we can soon end up with a very different culture than what we wanted to set out with. So that was just my build on everything. But thank you all for kind of kicking us off with the conditions there. The next one, which is one that's dear to my heart, which is about trust. How do we best go about building trust in a virtual environment? And full disclosure here, Ciara and I are colleagues at the Oxford Group. We have never met face to face physically, have we, Ciara?
No, we
but
haven't.
Yeah, I like to think we do have, you're going to have to nod to this because we're live on a podcast, but a good level of trust that's been achieved. So
I think so.
There is
yes. And Elizabeth, I think I've only met online as well.
Okay.
And Gabriella and I are fortunate to be former colleagues, so I know Gabriella very well from real life and from working very closely virtually as well. But yeah, building trust and engagement virtually. I think going back to the last point we were making around consistency, I think for me it's definitely been a huge thing when I know how to predict somebody's behaviors and what's good for them, and so when is something looking good and when is something not looking so good. So that predictability and knowing what normal and abnormal looks like for an individual, but also that consistency in terms of, if I send a Teams message, I know that person has a preference and they'll probably get back to me quite quickly, or this individual is very likely to pick up a Teams call or would prefer me to schedule it in. So that consistency in terms of our behaviours, but also as leaders as well in terms of how we build trust and engagement, that consistency in our behaviours is incredibly important, as well as it might be physically in the work environment, the shadow you cast, etc. The virtual shadow you cast, I think, is very interesting. How available you can be online, I think, is the same principles apply.
Fabulous. Thank you. I like that that virtual shadow is a new term. So yeah, that's an interesting one. Gabriella, Elizabeth, anything to build on there?
Yeah, I really love what you said there, Karen, and it sparks a couple of things for me. One is that, you know, the things that it takes, I think there's an illusion that they're different virtually, that somehow you have to find magic different stuff and do it to build trust virtually. But I think things like the demonstration of integrity over time, for example, which is fundamental in building trust, is exactly the same. So whether you meet somebody once a week on Zoom or once a week in person, or you've never met them, the ability to be real, to be consistent, to keep your promises, to keep your word, to respect boundaries, to seek to understand the whole person, not just the presenting issue, I think they're exactly the same. And it's really interesting because there's a neuroscience colleague of ours whom Andy knows very well, who makes a really good point that we think we're missing information in the virtual space about how to build connections, but actually we're not. We can see the person, we can hear them, we're free to ask questions, as Gabriella said, we're free to look at them, we're free to tell them what we feel, how we think, we're free to leave some nice space to listen, and that's completely available to us. So I would just love to challenge the illusion that it can't be done virtually. And I think one very brief story about that is that somebody I'm partnering with at the moment in a piece of development work, she's in New York. I've never met her. We speak once a month, and we've had the most incredibly challenging, high trust, exploratory conversations, completely gone there. Why? Because we're committed to the building of trust, and because both people are, you do it, don't you? So I love what you said about the consistency, the boundaries, and challenging the assumption it can't be done well.
Yeah.
People are people.
Yeah, completely agree. Gabriella, what's your thoughts?
Well, I do absolutely agree with that, as I've been reflecting on what actually is different. And I think so much is actually the same. It's just maybe we have to get used to doing it online. But I have thought about a couple of things that probably are actually different. And one is our environments that we're sitting in may be different. When you're in the office, you almost have, there's a level of equality because you're all in the same environment. And I remember very clearly one conversation with a colleague during COVID, the early part of COVID, where she told me that she was living in Oxford and she was in a studio apartment, and her desk or her office space was basically in her cupboard. And I thought, wow, it's, if you have a living room or you have a space in your house where you've got a good office space, that makes a big difference. Hopefully a lot of people have sort of worked some of that challenge out by now, but I think there can still be an equality thing. Like if someone has, to deal with a lot of background stuff, if they've got kids or, other challenges going on. So I think that's one thing to consciously think about. Should I have my background blurred in this call? Or shall I, actually have it on so that people can see my pets coming and crawling onto my desk? And is that going to actually help create more connection and trust? And the other thing that I thought, which is slightly different, but I've been thinking about the hybrid challenge, and I think for managers there is a real tension around fairness, and it's slightly off the virtual conversations topic, but I think there's a reality about, like, how do managers maintain a feeling of fairness in terms of, like, how many days people come into the office, when they come in, who, should they all meet together? Some people might want that, some people might not want that. So I think that is, again, it's linked with trust as well, that people know that you're going to be fair. And I think that is a genuine challenge that we need to think about.
Yeah, I completely agree. That kind of distance from a hub sometimes makes you feel slightly disconnected, and I think with that disconnection sometimes there's a space that we fill with our own narrative that maybe we wouldn't feel if we were connected with a load of people that had different views that might balance our own views as well. So I think some of the conditions leading into the conversation actually do have an effect on how you build trust. One of the things that we share at the Oxford Group all the time is we use the notion of the trust equation, and the things that go into making up trust in this particular model are credibility. So are you someone that presents yourself as something that you are and not something that you're not? Are you reliable? So going to a lot of the things that Elizabeth and Ciara shared a second ago, do you fulfill the promises that you've made to people? Do they know what they're going to get from you on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday? Or are you one of those people that's great on a Monday, but you don't want to go near them on a Friday? So how do you know what you're going to get from those people? And then the last piece, which is intimacy, and that's a really interesting one, because that's probably the one that people would challenge is harder to achieve virtually. But I don't know about that. I'm not convinced, because I think I've had some extremely authentic and open, honest conversations with people where things have been revealed and shared in a boundaried area where I trust that they won't go any further. So again, similar to you, Elizabeth, would challenge the notion that that can't be achieved virtually. The interesting one, which is self-orientation. So all of those things can be great. You can have the highest credibility in the world, the highest reliability, the highest intimacy in the world. But if someone senses you're being insincere, or that it's all about them, not about you, then that can be what breaks down trust. And I think there is a harder job for us to do as leaders and managers to show that we aren't self-orientated by being present, by really connecting and zooming in on that person, and not the your Outlook inbox that's buzzing at you below, because that can easily give off a sense maybe that you are self-orientated. So that piece about presence, I think, is just so important. You've got to be absolutely on it as a leader, having these one-to-one conversations or group conversation with your people. Great. Okay, so what about top tips for performance management then? Because this is an area that some sort of as Ciara, you teed up, it can get neglected in a physical world.
It can. I think I was just thinking about what you said there about really creating the space and the time and trying to avoid distractions as much as possible. So thinking about managing performance virtually and really dedicating the time for it. We're all really time strapped. We seem to have more meetings than ever before. We're bouncing from team meeting to teams meeting. We're constantly back to back. So, but it's important to get your head in the right space, like you would if you were meeting somebody for a proper performance conversation where you would go for coffee or lunch or whatever. If you were physically in the office, you'd give yourself that moment to walk from A to B, to maybe have that chat as you walk somewhere or as you find the meeting room or something. So how can you build that space in between to make sure that you've got that thinking time, to get yourself a drink, to make sure that you arrive in that meeting in the best way possible, ready to give yourself to that time, to dedicate that to the person that you're talking about their performance with. So yeah, my thoughts on it about how really time strapped we are and how that affects our behaviors and how we show up with people. And it's the same virtually.
Yeah, I'm with you. Elizabeth, Gabriella, thoughts?
I think probably what strikes me as particularly important is using the development one-to-ones with people, using those development conversations to focus on habits of performance, not just diving into today's issues or this week's details or whatever, but really pull back from that and use those one-to-ones to help the person look at what are the patterns of where they're succeeding, what are the patterns of where they're struggling, what habits have they got that are serving them well, and what habits have they got that are derailing them. And I think if you've only got an hour and you're on Zoom or it's a kind of complex time situation, go for the habits and patterns. Don't go for the minutiae of this week's issues.
Interesting.
I really love that point about habits, actually, because I was reflecting on how, there is a general trend moving away from measuring performance by, how many hours you're sitting at your desk, more towards the output. But it's been interesting in conversations with many managers, I've heard them say, well, I'm actually more worried about my team member working too many hours now that they're working from home or whatever, than not, than skiving off the job. And I think so that point about having conversations about what are healthy work habits and patterns, and it's really hard, but also role modeling it as much as you can. I know so many managers are like, well, I can't even do it, but I think like really reflecting on your own habits and patterns and what messages that is communicating subtly to your team members is so important. Yeah, the one that I found managers most struggling with online in terms of managing performance is giving feedback. That's the thing that came up again and again. Oh, it's so hard to give feedback online. But I must say, I really do think it's there's a bit of conflation of things, and I think a lot of the time, if you aren't having opportunities to observe someone in their role to be able to get that practice, it's more likely that it's because you're not working on the same projects or the same clients. And so same as before, thinking about where else can you get that feedback from, who is working on the same things, who is observing that person in real life, and getting that feedback that way. And then the difficult feedback or the constructive feedback, I think it's the same things we've been talking about around trust, but making it as much as possible part of your regular conversation so that it's not unusual to have a feedback conversation. I think managers sometimes feel it becomes very formal when it's online, but I think if it's regular and part of the norm of what you normally talk about, that can help.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll share an interesting scenario I had relatively recently with a participant on one of our programs, the Oxford Group, and they were talking about they're a hybrid world. So they were doing some face-to-face and some virtual, and they had a difficult conversation to have with a member of their team. And they posed the question, should it came from a point of comfort. They were more comfortable in their mind having that conversation face-to-face, but they didn't have another face-to-face touch point for 3 weeks. And the question was, is it okay to wait? So I know what my response was to that, but I'm interested in your view. Do you wait 3 weeks to have the conversation physically, or take another path? What's your views?
I'm a little bit torn on that one because it depends what it is. But actually, I think I'm just going to roll back from that and say, well, no, the principles apply exactly the same. If you need to give feedback, don't sit on it, because that's actually doing disservice to your colleague, to your team member by holding back from something. Maybe if it's a longer conversation that needs to be had, then yeah, maybe it might serve you better maybe to talk about it initially virtually and then follow up again in 3 weeks' time. Yeah, that's probably what I'd say.
Thanks, Ciara. Other thoughts?
I think I would feel the same, and I think it can be really good just to open up with a person and say, look, here's something I wanted to share with you, and let's both think about it, and then when we're together, date X, let's have a deep dive into it and understand the context and more about it. But this way, here's what I've got so far. What have you got so far? Let's pull what we know. Let's both give it some thought, and then we can really sit down and get to grips with what's going on and how to create something really good. The advantage of that, I think, is that you give them the respect of giving them time to consider it, and you take time to consider it. And I think that makes it a much richer conversation than just, bang, here it is, or 3 weeks. Yeah,
for sure. Gabriella, what about you? What's your thoughts?
Not very different to what's been shared, but I agree, because I think taking a coaching approach when you are having a feedback conversation is powerful. So, giving the person the opportunity to think about it can be helpful. And if they want to have an immediate conversation, great. If they want to have some time to think about it, that's also fine. But, asking them, what happened or how did it go, or, you know, giving them an opportunity that they know they're going to have a chance to speak and to share their views, I think in general as a feedback principle is really good.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. That's great insight. Okay, so our next question is this kind of emerging hybrid reality that we see ourselves in now. It's slightly, well, it's different, isn't it, just to a pure virtual conversation. There's other things that we should consider. So what would be your top tips to leaders operating in a hybrid world?
I'm happy to go first. I have thought about a few key things, and this is very much coming from my own recent experience of returning to the office and having a lot more hybrid meetings. I think it can be really helpful to actually actively assign someone the role of ensuring that equality and inclusion when you have some people online and some people in the room, so they actually play that role actively. I think what we've started to do is actually bring our laptops into the room. If there's some people who are online and some of you in the room, if you need to like share screens or use whiteboard or flip charts, actually everyone having their laptop, even if you're in the room together and logged into the call with yourself on mute if you're using a speakerphone, it somehow makes it easier to do different activities, gives it more flexibility, and also if you have your own webcam on, it can be better than, having a camera where there's like 10 people in the room but you can't really see who's in the room. And then I think that the other thing I'm trying to be more conscious of myself is banter and side conversations, which is so tricky because you don't want to spoil the atmosphere. But I think if it's not audible to everyone and if it's not including everyone, try to save it for outside the meeting. It's just trying to be more conscious of that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of those rules of engagement that are coming in again into the hybrid space. Yeah, I'm with you. Great, thank you. Ciara, what about you?
I was thinking about some experiences that I had in speaking to managers about encouraging their teams to come back into the office and moving into the hybrid world, and actually how difficult managers were finding it to navigate that conversation about somebody's level of comfort, especially in those early days when we're returning to the office. It can be very, for a lot of people, it has been a very daunting experience, and maybe they don't feel as safe as they did. Maybe confidence has taken a knock, who knows? But the managers I found that were doing it really well were those that kept trying to have the conversation and kept opening that space and that opportunity and looking for different options to invite people to come and have conversations, whether that was virtual or whether that was maybe we could meet at the office, but we meet outside for a walk to start off with. And I know that maybe with this, we're having this conversation a little bit late because a lots of people have returned to office working and now kind of set in patterns. I think that the same principle applies, that as a manager, as a leader, it really is your responsibility to model that way, to push to have those conversations, because at the end of the day, you're being judged on the performance of your team, and you really need to know how your team are, how they're performing, and be on the ball. So yeah, I'm just kind of reflecting on trying to create that balance between helping people to feel comfortable and safe, but also the absolute need to keep tabs on performance and to have those quality, robust conversations about performance, and just making sure that they don't slip.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ciara. Elizabeth, any closing thoughts on that one?
I guess something really, really simple and really fundamental, and that's leaders role modeling what they want. So, if we want people to be comfortable working in a hybrid environment, be comfortable working in a hybrid environment. So that's to say the leader not always being there in person, the leader not always dialing in, the leader not always, but actually to let people see that as a leader, we don't just believe it, we're doing it. And those leaders I've experienced recently who've been doing that really well have been absolutely clear that they themselves are mixing it up and varying it and trying it out and doing it. So I think we all know people don't do what they hear, they do what they see. So do what we wish people would do, basically.
Isn't that so true? Okay, so we're going to close out with, you're going to hate this question, because, sorry, I'm going to, so I'm going to ask you to narrow down your one top tip for nailing virtual conversations. If you, over and above everything else, what would be your one top tip? I don't know who wants to go first.
Okay, I'll go first. Consistency of clarity. What is this meeting? Why are we here? Like you would do face to face. Make sure that people are on board, whether it's a one-to-one or a group. You know why you're there, what you need to achieve in the conversation. I think that's just really good practice, especially when we've got loads of meetings all the time. It's just what are we here for, and that consistency in that clarity.
Thank you. Thanks, Ciara. So consistency and clarity.
I think mine would be look for the underlying pattern in what's happening. Don't get lost in the detail. And as a subset of that, remain 100% present.
Fantastic. Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm frantically writing this down, as you probably noticed. Gabriella.
I have to say the first thing that jumped into my mind again was presence. And maybe if I was to give a top tip to make that practical, it would be schedule a little bit of time between meetings or before virtual meetings to, have a bio break, get a glass of water, help yourself to be in that present state before the virtual conversation.
I would definitely say
fantastic. Yeah, cheers. Thank you so much to all three of you. We really could carry this conversation on for a lot longer, and I always hate bringing proceedings to a close, but we really, really do truly appreciate your time, your energy, and sharing your insights there. Just a few closing thoughts from us. This is as I said, the final of 3 conversations. So if you want to check out the other 2 conversations about conversations, then they're available on our YouTube channel and also via our website. Whilst you're there, you could subscribe to the Oxford group. And if you want to have a dive onto our website, you'll be able to access the recordings through the Insights tab. And you may also want to sign up to our newsletter to make you aware of other things like this that we're doing, events, and other articles that we're putting out that could be helpful to you as leaders and managers to help you thrive. So I'm going to bring the conversation to a close just by saying thank you again to our guests, Gabriella, Elizabeth and Ciara, and take care, everyone.